This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Robert J. Patterson, who teaches in the Department of Black Studies at Georgetown University. Along with numerous scholarly essays and journals and edited collections, he is the author of Destructive Desires, Rhythm and Blues Culture, and the Politics of Racial Equality from 2019, and Exodus Politics, Civil Rights and Leadership in African American Literature and Culture from 2013, co-editor of The Psychic Hold of Slavery, Legacies in American Expressive Culture in 2016, and editor of the award-winning Black Cultural Production After Civil Rights from 2019. In this conversation, we discuss curriculum writing in Black studies, historical research in Black study, and the place of cultural studies in the field. Good afternoon, Robert. How are you today?
Good afternoon. I'm doing well. What about yourself?
I'm doing all right. It's a rainy, humid day, like the 80th in a row here in the DMV. I know you know this. So
Yes.
But my grades are turned in. So I'm not teaching this summer, so getting back to things that I really want to be doing, including this podcast, and been really looking forward to this conversation and having you on your voice as part of the series. So I appreciate you making the time, and I'm really looking forward to your thoughtfulness across this conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be a part of this important conversation as well. So I'm excited. I did not have any grades to turn in this semester, and I am finishing my stint as department chair. So this is an exciting time for me in different ways.
Finishing stint as department chair is that is an exhale that, I swear you could hear from states away. So I'm happy to hear that. I was associate chair and that was enough. Chair.
Yes.
That's a lot. So, well, let me start. We'll have a chance to talk about your research and how you think about the field of Black studies and all of that. But wanted to start really with a more personal question and ask, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, always this important companion piece is what keeps you connected and keeps you committed to this kind of work?
Thank you for the opportunity to reflect on, in some respects, the origins of my interest in Black studies before I was thinking of Black studies, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think about the past. And so I'm from Hartford, Connecticut, and I grew up in a predominantly Black community. And when I was in sixth grade, I went into a busing program, which is now called Capital Region Educational, something like that. But in any case, at the time it was called Project Concern. And the idea was that it would give students who went to more urban or inner city schools the opportunity to benefit from the essentially resources and privileges that some of the suburban schools had without having to pay for private school. And so for K through 5, I was in Hartford's public school system. I went to Martin Luther King Elementary School. And then from 6 through 12, I was in the Glastonbury public school system, and I graduated from Glastonbury High School. During that time, one of the profound experiences that I had was recognizing two things. The first was that there was a significant disparity in resources, which, though I was not necessarily using this language at the time, though that disparity was directly related to life chances, outcomes, and possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so for U.S. history, with Mr. Cooper, I remember this, we had to write a term paper. And it might have been surprising to some, but not necessarily to people who might have known me well. I wrote a term paper that wasn't against the program I was in. So I like to tell people this was not a Clarence Thomas-esque type paper, but what the paper was about was saying that regardless of the benefits that these programs afford to the students who are participating in them, they treat the symptom but not the ailment, which is simply to say there is a a sizable population of students who are still in the Harvard public school systems who still do not get access to these resources, education opportunities, and that is actually a problem. And so part of what the term paper really was getting at was how do we address the root causes, though not using that language, of educational inopportunities that are structured in housing discrimination, right? That are structured in, as I teach now in certain classes, deserts across the period. So there's not, we use the language of food deserts, but that's not just what it is. It's a resource desert
Mhm.
that then has tangible and intangible outcomes. And so that was my introduction into structural inequalities that are grounded in historical practices, policies, and preferences, I would actually say as well. And so that actually began what would later take on, I think, where my career is now, what my interests are. Now I have done other, I think, important work in there about cultural production, about the role that the arts play in shaping politics. And I think that this is all connected. And the bottom line, though, is as I talk about, write about, and think about the legacies of slavery and the legacies of Jim Crow and how and why they still matter, that is rooted in what I just said about my experience in education between the Hartford public school system and the Glastonbury public school system.
That's first of all, it's amazing. I love it when this not just this sense of Black studies and this sort of inquisitive, moment that leads to this future kind of work. I love it when it not only arrives in sort of college or graduate school, but in this moment where, like you said, you remember the teacher's name and it's Mister, it's not Professor, Doctor,
Right.
and this moment, and yeah, how did he receive the paper? I'm totally curious.
Well, it is funny because if we were in person or if this was a show, I could pull out the envelope. I actually still have this high school stuff
Well, I
that
was
is
going to
in
follow up and
my
ask if you still had it. Amazing.
I do. I still have the quizzes. Because I had him for a couple of times before I got to US history. But he received it well. He thought it was well done. And it was also rooted in a case that led to some of the desegregation in Hartford Public Schools, which was Sheff versus O'Neill. So this was an earlier case in Connecticut that had gone through the court system. And so that was sort of I had the legal and historical that was put next to the personal,
Mm,
and,
mhm.
and, and sort of thinking about how this worked together. But he received the paper well. You know, it displayed the characteristics of good research. This is not sort of tooting my own horn or anything of the sort, but I was always interested in education. I was good at school and I enjoyed school. And so that mix of interests and characteristics made things or, activities like writing a term paper actually interesting.
Mm, mhm.
Um,
How did that carry over to college and graduate school? I mean, did you see that, this is a big moment. I mean, in so many ways, I love the way you've articulated it. Was college that moment where it's sort of the excitement and insight and motivations of this sort of continued and got fulfilled, or has this been a fits and start thing?
So it has morphed. So I was always bound to be in education, it seemed. And so my sister and I have a decade age difference. And so I, in many ways, grew up by myself. My cousins, everybody's older. And so I used to have people would tell these stories. I used to have these imaginary classes that I would be teaching and educating. And I just
Wow.
knew that I was going to teach, but I never knew it was going to be college. And I didn't necessarily know about the research side. In fact, as I advanced, so from elementary to middle to high school, I wanted to teach at each of those levels. And so
Mhm.
in that respect, that I would end at the collegiate level may not have been surprising. But the plan was to finish undergrad, go back to Connecticut, teach long enough to get my administrative certificate, and I had intended to be a superintendent of an urban public school system, and that was initially the path. But then I was at Georgetown, which is where I did my undergraduate degree, and a friend of mine, Sawika Colbert, who I've collaborated with on the Psychic Hold of Slavery and other projects, and who is now at Georgetown as well. She was working with Professor Kim Hall, and they had a program called at the time Minority Mentoring. And so Sawika basically said, there's this program. You should come to it, and there's going to be free food. And she already knew that she had buried the lead because if free food was involved, then I probably would show up. And so when I went to that, part of what they were talking about were summer research opportunity programs.
Mhm.
And so I said, okay, this might be interesting, right? I could go back to Connecticut and work at the bank of the summer, or I could go somewhere at a college or university and think about things that I probably wouldn't have time or interest in thinking about if I were working my 9 to 5. And so Sawika did one of those, and then I sort of took on a similar role with Professor Angela Mitchell. And so we were putting on these programs for the minority mentoring, which was really about helping students to think about the professoriate as an option for underrepresented groups. And so I actually went to Stanford the summer after my junior year of college. I had the opportunity to get a head start on my honors English senior thesis, which was about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and Richard Wright's Native Son. And while I was there, it just was really a lot of exposure. It was sort of, what is the rhythm of a professor, right? Because as a student, you see them teach, you might understand the research, but you don't get the rhythm of what this actually means, the life of the mind,
Yeah.
as I would come to know it later from one of my grad school advisors, the late Rudolph Byrd. But when I was there that summer, it was still on the cusp because I was thinking, I'm going to graduate school. So that wasn't debatable. But the question was, am I going to apply to PhD programs? I'm going to apply to EDD programs. Or am I going to apply to PhD programs in education? Right.
Mhm.
And I got back after spending the summer working on the honors thesis and working with the professor. So I had worked with Arnold Rampersad, who at the time was at Stanford, an eminent Ellisonian scholar,
Wow.
and Donna Jones, who was a junior faculty member there, who was my direct advisor for the program. And when I got back, I said, okay, I'm not sure these two paths are tenable. I think I need to make a choice about which path I want to go. And part of it was about the life of the mind, but part of it was about expanding and keeping options, opportunities open. And I thought that the PhD in education was likely out because that would put me on a specific trajectory that might have been more narrow than what I might have actually really wanted. Because at the end of the day,
Mhm.
part of what I want is to have opportunities and have options. And so I thought, well, the PhD would give me an expansive way of thinking about the particularities of what I'm interested in, which is not necessarily about education. It's about these larger factors that education is a part of that have to do with Blackness and Black life.
Mhm.
And that if I did want to go back the administrative path in a public school system, there would be supplemental routes that I could do, which wouldn't be another PhD in education or EDD for that matter. I could get licensed. I could get the administrative certificate. I have long-standing friends who were in education, so I kind of knew what that path was, and I knew that there were several ways to get there. And so I made the decision that I do want to do this research. I want to explore different aspects and facets of Black life. But even at that time, I sat not really gotten to the structural stuff per se, even though the honors thesis did think about that as it was looking at Black masculine, the construction of Black masculine identities in those texts.
Mm.
But it still hadn't gotten to what I really talked about in the latter half of my research, which are these structural institutional explanations and solutions to Black inequalities and inequities, because that's a part of my language now in a way that it wasn't then too.
I love how transformative summer program is in this narrative. I think there's all kinds of ways that students get pulled into this kind of work, and I think these summer programs are often like underappreciated in terms of their really transformative work. So I love that. By the way, just as an aside, I love Donna Jones's book on life philosophy. So
Okay, wonderful.
One of my favorite books. So Donna, if you listen, great book. She and I have chatted about it many times. So let me ask you about Black Studies. My question is really, what is that portrait of Black Studies for you? Like, what is that what 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 is that idea of Black Studies? How do you imagine the field? And I ask this in the context of its founding, which had a tension built into it, right? There was the demand by students in the late 1960s, early 1970s that there be a place on campus to study the Black intellectual tradition, that this was something that traditional disciplines had done barely at all, if at all. And Black studies departments in their founding have become, were and have been that place where the Black intellectual tradition is studied and developed. And that we inherit that today with this commitment of the field to the tradition. But of course, the late 1960s and early 1970s is that moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where some of these boundaries between, books and activism, between classrooms and communities, between ideas and mobilization are really blurred and contested. And I think we inherit that demand of Black studies in terms of its politics, and that it asks of us a commitment to a certain kind of liberatory politics. Right. And I never want to call that a contradiction. I think it's very much a tension, but it is one often around a commitment to a politics and a commitment to intellectual life. And sort of couched in those terms, I'm interested to hear you talk about the portrait or imagination of the field of Black studies that orients you.
Yeah, and so this question is important for a lot of reasons, not only the ones you articulated, but the intentional, um, and spiteful attempts by the current administration to is not just erode Black progress, right, in all the other ways, but erode the gains made, particularly in education, right, and having access to universities, but not it's not just that, it's also what's taught at these institutions,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And so for me, this question has been to the forefront of my imagination, not only because I've taught the introduction to Black studies in the past couple of years a few times, but I also worked with the College Board on developing the high school AP African American Studies course. And so in those conversations with other college professors and high school teachers who are delivering the curriculum, we really had to think about, what does this Black studies mean at the contemporary moment, and what is it like? So for me, who first had an encounter with a Black studies undergraduate course at a TA at Emory, the professor I worked with, Nagyalti Warren, this town and gown relationship, right,
Mhm.
between the education community was central to the work that we were doing with the students. And so I say that simply to say, when I teach, when I think about the formation of Black studies or ethnic studies, I start with the documentary San Francisco State on Strike, because I think that for me, part of what that part of what that documentary does is it brings into conversation all of the, or many of the issues that are at stake. So there is what's actually being taught, what's actually being thought about, right? A Black intellectual, cultural, political tradition that is made possible because of not only the civil rights legislation that allows Black people to enter these places that had previously excluded them, but it's the Black campus movement that is directly related to what the Black power struggle is articulating.
Mhm.
And so I say that to say the politics of the era, along with what's happening at the universities, for me is an ever guiding principle of how I'm thinking about what a department can and or should be doing as one part. And then how does that scholarly project relate to that? And so I think that in phases of careers, this matters. So in the early part of my career, I had a very clear understanding that the goal that I was pursuing was to get tenured and promoted, and then to get promoted again, so that I could within the context of the university, exercise my influence to be able to advance the missions of Black studies as various as they may be. So for me, I think it is important that the scholarship attempts to move the needle of the politics from the historical perspective into the contemporary moment. And so what I mean by that is when I wrote my first book, I remember thinking there is a way that this will get read perhaps by other academics, and it will perhaps influence the political conversation and influence Black studies in the sense that it is developing this intellectual tradition that might be otherwise not thought about, ignored, not as fully fleshed out as it could be. At the same time, I did not want to overstate how that book, in its own right, would kind of shape the everyday conversation.
Mhm.
It's not written to do that. It is not designed to do that. And I think that as a person who does community service, who does a lot of the work that Black studies will want people to do, even if it's not solely in the academic context, it was important for me to have that shift of understanding because there are different audiences that have to be attended to, satisfied, and responded to. And I think that what Black Study does is it addresses that fact and it allows for individuals to think about how you're going to do this on your own, but in conversation with a broader community. And I think that's very important because I think that there are debates about, how much should this be a theoretical orientation, how much should this be a community orientation or whatever the case is. I think Black Studies is it has enough space to allow for those different visions. And while I like the fact that you use the word that there is a tension, too often they are framed in the language you did not use, which is competing visions
Yeah.
of what Black Studies was, what Black Studies can be, or what it actually should be.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you for that. That was fantastic. I love that account, and you started off talking about our current administration, and it is one of those things. I've said this in a number of episodes where when my colleague Ashley and I were formulating these questions for the series, because they're common across every episode. Um, was pre-current administration, and I think that tension seemed like a richer kind of tension, whereas now sometimes just teaching a book is itself sort of life or death politics. But
Yeah.
I don't know quite how we arrived here, but it's where we are, and maybe says something about how the political meaning of the kind of work, as you said, the kind of audiences that we attend to,
Right.
and the politics of that particular audience, that is young people, is
Right.
maybe more powerful than I had anticipated or appreciated.
I mean, I think that there is a sense, and I talked about this. I had a paper at the American Studies Association this in November of 25, and a question came up that I made this point about, and I'll make this point I think continually because it's important, and it's seemingly perhaps simplicity I think is why it's actually important. So you know in an earlier part of Black studies, there was archival or recovery work, I believe people were kind of using at the time. They weren't
Yeah.
necessarily thinking about it as archival work, this recovery work. And then if you think about the way that Black feminism blossoms, and we sort of start thinking about from double jeopardy to intersectionality. And I'm using these examples because I think that there was a moment, maybe early 21st century, where I think at some camps, there was a thinking that the work on this has been exhausted. What else is there to say
Uh,
about some of these issues? And we want to talk about this, that, or the other thing. And I think that what's happening now in the political context, uh, in many respects, demonstrates why the continuing work around some of those issues needs to be consistently reinforced,
Mm.
right? When we think, and so I'm not gonna, I could go on, but I'm not gonna go about that. And I think that that becomes a thing. And so sometimes in Black studies, I think that we are accustomed to talking to people who know Black studies. We're accustomed to talking to people who are familiar with the concepts of Black studies. And we take some of these archives to my mind, and concepts that to my mind are still um, filled with untapped aspects that need to be explicitly articulated, that need to be demonstrated by way and through example. And we let that be done. And that, in some respects, has allowed, it is not blaming Black studies by any stretch of imagination, but in some of our movements to do, I think, some of this other work that's important, it has perhaps allowed for the seeming exhaustion of
Mm,
things that
mhm.
I actually do not think are exhausted, and that in some unfortunate ways, the right has co-opted. Now, the right would have co-opted these things irrespective, because this is what the goal was.
Yeah.
I do think, too, because I think both things can be true at once, that there is a way that some of the earlier work, ideas, and concepts get taken as settled or otherwise passe, and they're not.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's, um, I mean, there's lots of things about this podcast already that make the listening worth it, and that especially. So I really appreciate that. That's really that's a lot to think about. Yeah. Thank you for that. Let me shift a little bit and ask you then about your work in relation to the field of Black studies. You know, you've an interest in cultural studies. You've talked a bit about it, civil rights history, political theory, and it's a collection of interests that just has so many insights for the field of Black studies. And I'm interested to hear you reflect a little bit on how you see your work in relation to the history of Black studies, sort of where it fits, but also what new horizons you think it opens up, or what boundaries you think it pushes.
Yes. So I think that that's an excellent question. Thank you. I think that when I think of some guiding thinking around Black studies, one of the essays that comes to mind, it's about a decade old, from the preeminent Darlene Clark Hine. It was I believe it was in the Black Scholar. It was a series of essays, I think, in that issue, thinking about different field issues. But the one I'm referring to from her is The Black Studies Mind. And part of what that essay does, or that article does, is it sort of thinks methodologically around themes or guiding principles that sort of shape the work of how one thinks when one is doing Black studies. And so part of it is about sort of thinking about time nonlinearly, right? That's one of the principles. Another one is sort of collapsing this, is not resistance oppression, but the point sort of is that how does one resist and while being oppressed, right? So it's sort of thinking about resistance doesn't look in one specific way, and then using these things to read cultural texts or primary texts. And so I say that to say, before I had encountered that essay, I think that that is part of what my work had been doing. It had been giving ways to think about how to bring what might seem to be a seemingly disparate set of text or archives that may not readily go together, but that, to my mind, demonstrate how the um, different either cultural forces or cultural sources end up making meaning by and through each other. And so early on in my first book on Exodus politics, when I was primarily extending work I had done in my dissertation, but taking up some new texts and a new framework, I was really thinking about Black leadership and what are the imaginative possibilities for Black leadership, for thinking about civil rights more expansively, that we get from literary texts, and why do literary texts add to the conversation in ways that quote unquote historical documents may or may not.
Mhm.
And part of what I think is important about that work is that, again, Black people's exclusion from formal politics, so thinking of someone like Richard Iton or Gene Jarrett and others, it allowed them, in some respects, helped them, or you could say force them to go into these other places to have influence and to stake their political claims in a way in politics. I resist the forced part because I do think that there is something generative about Black studies that is non-reactive or not solely reactive to the ubiquitous and overarching presence of white supremacy and anti-Black racism. So that is there. And there's also something else that is formulating because of Black people's investment in their current culture, African retentions, or whatever the case might be. So I did that. I did that work. The next thing I do in terms of monographs is I'm thinking about it's time to take up this issue of structural inequality. It is time to, in a very forceful way, I hope, push back on the notion that Black people's behaviors are the explanation for and solution to all these forms of structural inequality. But I really locate that in the what I call the intimate sphere or Black intimate relations. And I'm sort of thinking about there's all this discourse about Black families and what Black families do or don't do. And there has been all this attention paid to Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report, right? The Negro Family and the Case for National Action. But there was something about the critiques of that work, which were valid, that I also thought did not tell the whole story. Because in that report, Moynihan actually does give some structural attention to the problems facing Black families. But because of this other discourse about Black families, people run with that other thing, right?
Hmm.
So I wanted to look at that, and I wanted to look at rhythm and blues, not just the music, but the culture more broadly, to think about if there's a space in Black culture that is thinking about the Black family, Black relations, Black sex, or whatever the case is, it is rhythm and blues culture. The reason it's culture, not just music, is because part of the case I'm making, which is what I said, something I made earlier, is that the making of this or the meaning that's being made here doesn't happen just in the music, particularly in the 90s. How does the music, how does the soundtrack, how does the film that the soundtrack came from, how do the people in their brands that are acting or singing contribute to the collective meaning making, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in that work, part of what I'm trying to do is give a methodology, though I don't necessarily use that language, but how to bring these multiple cultural forms together to articulate how they're thinking about or responding to something that people don't think they think about or respond to, that they're sort of just singing these songs as though, no, this is a very present part of the discourse. And so I do that. And then in my most recent work, The Black Narratives of Slavery, a very short introduction, part of what I think is important in that work is, number one, introducing a broad range of people to something that us specialists or we specialists may sort of know. Okay, of course, this is how you talk about these narratives, but there actually is not in the course there,
Mm-hmm.
and that's part of
Yeah.
part of what this does. And so, in a way that narrative closes, I'm talking about in the visual narratives of slavery chapter, I'm having a discussion and thinking through Nate Parker's The Birth of the Nation. There is this moment where I talk about or think through the ways that people may get tired of these movies, these films that are revisiting chattel slavery. And one of the questions I say is how many more, bruised bodies, abused bodies does one need to see to kind of understand this? While I do get that question, I think that these films are doing something that is even more remarkable, right? How have Black people formed, maintained communities, traditions, etc., despite all of the circumstances that would have obliterated that?
Mm-hmm.
How have Black people used ingenuity? How have Black people taken these tropes, these stereotypes that were supposed to be disempowering or otherwise place them at a disadvantage, and actually leaning into them and subverting them in order to get a desired outcome. And I sort of read that in a moment of that. And so I say all of that simply to say that part of what my view of Black studies, part of what I hope that my work in Black studies will open up is, number one, ways of, or to people's liking, methodologies or theories, right, of how to bring history, material culture, cultural production together that offers analyses that will push the needle on improving some set of conditions for Black people in Black lives. And sometimes that will happen in the work that is written, and sometimes that will happen how I then go and publicly articulate and translate that work in other contexts. And that is what I think is important about what my work is doing or can do for Black studies, and what some of the futures of Black studies will look like. The Black studies future is going to hinge on the ability to translate whatever our form of work output is to populations that are outside of not only academia, but spaces that think or wonder in the same ways in the languages that we may do. And how can I articulate to high school students why this matters and why this is important? How can I articulate this to a church crowd? How can I articulate this to a population that is unattached from the academy and that perhaps could not think less or in explicit ways care less about the legacies of slavery or civil rights or whatever the case might be, but are directly impacted by those things?
Let me follow up a little bit. Thank you for that. I'd love the very rich description of your interests in the field, but also like really deep imperatives that you brought us back to at the end there. I think so. In some ways, it's one of the cornerstones or aims of the podcast is to generate this sense of people's imperatives for the field. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your research and, in this case, around your own background and current workplace, which is, you did your PhD in a liberal studies program, which is a non-disciplinary education, and your ongoing work is in a Department of Black Studies, which is not a conventional or traditional discipline. So I'm interested in hearing you talk about how the fact that you haven't passed through a formal discipline in your doctoral and workplace training and practice, how you think that shaped how you conceive a research project, but also how it's shaped how you conceive and practice a classroom.
Yeah, so I don't think that I am. I think that part of what all that trajectory has done is to help me not to be bound by the ways that people sometimes are in these quote unquote right traditional disciplines. And so when I first, so 2 points here. When I first actually went to Emory, I didn't go into the ILA initially. I initially went into the English department.
Okay.
And there was a level of rigidity as it related to qualifying exams, as it related to how research should be done, that basically just did not seem like it was going to be ultimately a good fit. And so I had a conversation with one of the assistant deans in the graduate school after the first year. We talked about the comp exams. We talked about a variety of issues. And she said, well, maybe you might be a better fit over in the ILA. You should go talk to some of the professors. I did. And then we facilitated the move rather easily, and the rest in some respects was history. My first job following my PhD was actually in the Department of English. That was actually, it was at Florida State, and it was pretty open to the work of cultural studies or
Mhm.
thinking about the work that people did and how it could fit in an English department versus thinking this is what an English department should do and people's work should conform to that. And when I first came back to Georgetown, I was also in an English department that seemed receptive to people doing different types of work that wasn't quote unquote traditional English ways. But your point that it was non-disciplinary, I love that phrasing because it doesn't reinforce disciplinary in ways that intro these other things do. So I really like that term, and I may have to attribute it to you and borrow it in some subsequent conversation. What that path though did was it allowed me to not have to think about questions like what is it that what are the literary questions that we have to ask this? What is the literariness of this? Or I have colleagues and what is the sociology question? You don't have to ask that. And when I'm training or mentoring junior faculty members, I have to remind them you're in Black studies. So you don't have to be bound by some of these silos. I guess that's kind of what the word is that I'm not bound by these silos. So I can bring literature together with liberation theology or civil rights history or music or film or whatever the case is, and I can talk about why these projects go together and why we make meaning of them without necessarily having to justify why, as sources that are outside of a disciplinary boundary, they come together. I do justify and explain why they come together, but there isn't sort of this lens or this presumption that they should not be together. And I think that is what happens in some of the disciplines, is that there is a thinking that would suggest that only certain things are the purview of a fill in the blank. And Black studies just doesn't have that. And so, I sit on all kind of university committees, and I'll hear comments made sort of like, oh, these are the 5 journals one should publish in a field, and these are ranked in this particular way, and things that I understand and I also find to be perplexing, and am happy that is not the trajectory of my career and that I don't have to mentor people around said issues. But I do think it is important to know that language.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. Coming back to the ranking of journals is such an interesting sort of site around which to demonstrate these differences.
Right?
And I just will say, like, as a writer, I've really enjoyed. I'm a philosophy PhD, but I haven't been in a philosophy department for 20 something years, and that difference between justifying ahead of time or arguing for a connection or the legitimacy of a connection rather than demonstrating it or showing, right? Showing rather than arguing is
Right.
I mean, a lot of literary analysis is often like that, but I think that's also why so many English departments, I mean, certainly here at University of Maryland, so many English departments are kind of post-disciplinary at some level. I mean, you always have like disciplinary, sort of writers and thinkers, but so much of it hosts cultural studies, film studies,
Right.
and different kinds of histories. So, but that emphasis on showing, and it's sort of like, I will show the connections, but I'm going to show rather than have to like argue that this novel is relevant to a sociologist.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And in that ranking, I'll just say this too, that ranking is rooted in histories, practices, and contexts that would probably put journals that I would be interested in publishing in, and that would be interested to publish my work, out of this top, whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
Right? That because that's actually part of the thing too. So,
well, this is, I also try to not sideline too much on this. The ranking of journals has driven me fucking crazy for years, because I'm like, isn't our job as a committee to like read and evaluate this work? And the way we outsource it to some sort of number on an index at, Project Muse or wherever, I'm just like, you've got to be kidding me. Yeah, that just
it's an interesting movement.
Yeah. Sometimes we are our own worst enemies in academia, but Let me ask you this first of last two questions, sort of shift a little bit to a sort of wide lens, and ask you this penultimate question. What is it, thinking in a Black Studies context, what do you think Black Studies has historically done well, and what do you think it has historically not done so well?
Yeah, historically, I think Black Studies has done a profound job of our archival and recovery work of demonstrating, the long existence of Black cultural contributions, of Black history, of Black politics, across the diaspora and across time. Before Black Studies was a thing to be named as such, right? Black Studies was being done, and I think that is important to demonstrate and to articulate. I think Black Studies has taken a keen and important look at these legacy issues, right? So the legacies of fill in the blank, but of my particular interest, thinking about the legacies of slavery, the legacies of Jim Crow, thinking about how the silences of the archive also give us access to that information, and really beginning to look in perhaps some non-traditional places to sort of think about where you can glean what Black people were doing, what they were thinking, how they were feeling by what was not said, and then reimagining that, right? Because part of what that then does is it disrupts certain types of historical movements, historiographies, and certain types of documents from primarily narrating those stories, those histories, those whatever the case might be, and I think that that's important. I think calling attention to inequities, inequalities that are longstanding and structured, that are not rooted in behaviors, actions, or things of the sort, is a place that we are continuing to make headways and progress. And at this particular moment, that conversation continues to need to be pushed forward, and so I think that's important. And then I do think that sort of the proliferation of how one does Black studies, whether one identifies in this tradition or that tradition, how Black studies can be Africana studies, Pan African studies, all those things um, reflect, I think, the robustness of a field, but also the diversity of Black life, Black experience, which is what Black studies is taking up. And so having this proliferation, these multiple strands doesn't seem to be particularly, problematic for wherever one may or may not land on one's preferred mode of doing it. As far as what Black studies hasn't done particularly well, I mean, part of the challenge of this is that, Black studies as a academic institution, department, has really only been around 5 or 6 decades, as the point you're talking about, depending on where it was. And at Georgetown, just coming into our second decade as a department, though it had been an interdisciplinary program prior to that. So my point is this. Number one, I think that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so referring back to something that I said earlier, I do think that there is still work to be done on some of these ideas, these concepts, these archives that people might think of as otherwise having been exhausted.
Hmm.
Okay, so I think that I think that, and I stand firmly by that. I think that given the larger landscape, making sure that we use multiple mechanisms to articulate not why we should exist. I don't have time. I don't think that that's necessary, though I could see in some places where it could be. But to articulate in forceful ways, this is what we do. This is how we do it. These are different ways to do it. This is why it matters. These are the direct impacts of how the tools of Black studies impact your everyday living, your everyday options. And this is why this is important and something you could be interested in or would want your children to learn, of relatives or whomever else might be affected or influenced by it, that's actually work we can continue to do and do forcefully and more robustly.
Love that. Maybe then this is already, you've already started to answer this last question I have for you, which is thinking in a Black Studies context, what is the one issue you would want us to all be thinking about, or the one question you would want us to all be asking?
One thing that I do think that we can continue to reflect on and to make claims about is, in the absence of institutions supporting Black studies, how do we then still do the work of Black studies?
Mm-hmm.
Do we still do the work of Black studies? If some proclamation came down and said all these departments had to just be closed or removed, what then does that look like? Even if you go to a traditional department because you keep your job, whatever the case might be, what do we actually then do? How do we get the effects, aims, and impacts of Black studies outside of a university or institutional context?
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that answering that question or thinking about that question feeds back into the point I was making on the previous question.
I love that. What's a fantastic place to wrap up. I really appreciate that. I think that question you want us to ask, we should be asking it for so many reasons. As you said, you never know when this kind of decree comes.
Right.
But also it's a way of getting real precision about how we understand the kind of work we do. And when we
Right.
understand precisely what we do it better. I mean, I don't know how else to put it.
I think that's right.
Thank you so much for this. I mean, I was really excited about this conversation, and I think that I thought that your perspective and also, I mean, we didn't talk much about it, but working on the AP African American certificate program, all of these things were going to make this conversation so interesting. And it just has been absolutely fascinating and really thoughtful and insightful. You've given everybody who listens so much to think about. So thank you for your thoughtfulness, Robert, and obviously for your time, but really that thoughtfulness this is a great contribution to the series.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I think that this is important work and that this is going to be a part of the historical archive that I'm speaking about, that people will be able to return to and they'll think about what people said and didn't say as they continue to do the work of helping Black studies to march on.
Well, Ashley and I every once in a while talk about that, and then the idea that you write yourself into history is it's a little bit of vertigo, but
Listen,
really,
this is built on a tradition written by myself, who I would want me to write it.
But yeah, I mean, just the generosity of everybody on the series. I think there's so much. I mean, it's at this point, it's been months nonstop listening just to catch up. But this is a great contribution. And again, Robert, really thank you so much. And
Thank you.
have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.